was one of the main people.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the 80s, right? Early 90s. And Howard was right in the middle of that.
Well, if Bobby lets his hair grow a little longer and braids it, he could have his little Jared Lanier look.
Yeah. I'm getting there in a little different look. Certainly on the girth side, I'm catching up with them, and and the hair is getting a little wilder by the day too. I cut my wife's hair about 2 weeks ago, and I did a pretty good job. I watched 6 videos, and actually did a pretty cool layered look and the whole deal. And she's going to return the favor here sometime this weekend and trim me up a little bit.
Yeah, my girlfriend did the same thing on mine.
I think that there will be a cultural shift of the pandemic in micro ways as well as macro ways, and that's just one of a million ways that the shift is going to be accelerated. I think that the context of systems change, part of that, though, is not so much just the question of how we're changing our look, but across what we're doing, but I think it's a question of whether we can reach exponential speed of having intentionality reach feasibility. And I think that there's been a piece of that. Saskia, I don't know if the news coverage of the U.S. Shifts has reached in the New Zealand context quite globally, but I think the shifts that we've seen of institutions identifying with a systemic problem just since the last time we gathered on systemic change. In other words, I've seen more references to a systemic problem on the news than in my entire last 5 years in the last week on the news, I think. In other words, like the terminology that's been in our micro communities has suddenly reached a live global context, I think, which is wild.
That's true. I mean, I hadn't quite picked it up like that, but obviously there's a lot of news, but not necessarily the relation to systems thinking. I wonder if it is related to systems thinking or if it's just people picking up the term as such.
My theory on that is that we've seen an acceleration of loss of optimism, and that's manifested in questions about institutions, about the planet, about having visibility with people with their cameras to things that they may not have seen directly before. And then social interacting where people can amplify things themselves. It's not so much that it's going from a few centralized news sources. Is that chatter. So all of this stuff is like ferment for a sense of, well, what's happened to the world? And then why was it the way it was to begin with?
Yeah, exactly. Our view in the Game B space, I think I talked about this a few weeks ago when I was on here, is then this was just from the pandemic. It was our estimate that the number of people with ears to hear the message of radical social change was at least 10x larger than it had been before the pandemic. I think these new events up that number further. How far, much further, I don't know, but a bunch. And so the number of people who now see that the status quo is fundamentally not a good fit with the current world that we live in is reaching by far the highest level of people who have that realization, at least since 1968. And so we're approaching a moment where a lot of change is suddenly possible in a short period of time. Now, what that change is up to us, right? There is a million people pulling on ropes of all sorts, some good and some very bad. And so this is the time for us all to paddle as hard as we can on our individual canoes, aiming towards the good.
Well, I think it's a really exciting moment from the perspective of what systems change becomes feasible at this moment. I think from the perspective of where this intersects, if we look at it I've referred this week to the service learning singularity as the point at which we have 500 million people learning that the best way for them to learn is through service learning integration. In other words, that the best way for them to learn is through learning while supporting shared social cause and integrating their project management learning or their data science learning or their engineering learning into that process. Because right now we have the people who are impact interested and also who are early adoptive categories. But now that the pandemic has arrived, there's a context in which I think the average project manager would say there's something broken about the system. The average HR, human resource business partner in the world would say there's something broken about the system. And if that can then lead them to each become an agent in systems change, then you suddenly have 500 million people, half a billion people, willing to build the changes in the world that are needed for the 10 billion people who are here or arriving to be able to have regenerative lives. And I think that's exciting. So in other words, the idea that if you could make it convenient enough for the average person to participate, if you could make it easy enough, accessible enough, if you could connect to where they are in their professional journey, their life journey, etc., there's no reason why you couldn't have double-digit percentages of the world's population expressing agency vis-a-vis the system that they're otherwise complicit in. Because I think the recognition that there are broken parts of the system's failures that we are collectively able to be agentic to fix is now potentially predominant. Now there's a storytelling, marketing, communications, discovery, learning journey process that needs to be exponentially scaled for that to happen at exponential speed. But in principle, there's a billion allies out there in systems change.
Even if it's not a billion.
One of the early indications I had that this was resonating out there was the reaction to when I put down reimagining capitalism at the DNA level on the book. People like that idea. They weren't quite sure what it meant, but
Jim, you're starting to say something else as well too. What were you going to say?
I was saying a billion. That may be a little optimistic, but frankly, at this point, I would take a good solid high penetration of the 2% early adopter market, right? The innovator market. In the United States, that's 6 million people. If we had some reasonable percentage of 6 million people actually resonating with the message of radical social change, the world would change pretty rapidly. As opposed to those, again, there's people who think they're associated with radical systems change, but those that are principally focused on game A politics, somewhere in the range between Bernie and Trump. This is just a teeny little part of the overall design space, and it's getting people to realize that the room between Bernie and Trump is only about this big, as opposed to this gigantic design scape that we have in terms of designing a society that actually does work for everybody and that manages the strange loop. I've come around to this view that I think I don't know, I've talked about it other places. I don't know if I've spoken about it here. The tension in the change community between those who believe in personal change first and those who believe in institutional change first. And I've now come to conclude the obvious answer, as always, that it's both. But I've come with a little twist, which is it's really a strange loop. People are trying to grow to self-actualization, or at least they should be, as opposed to seeing who has the most toys when they die. But that self-actualization has to be significantly invested in co-creating a community that does what? Help us self-actualize, right? So we have a strange loop where part of the self-actualization has to be reinvested in a standing wave of a community that upregulates self-actualization.
Well, that's the question of service learning as preventing disposable learning and recycling a percentage of every learning minute if think about it this way, like you have an N1 for the escape rate of the pandemic, we have a learning recycling rate. If we get to the point where we're able to recycle XYZ percentage of every learning minute from every human year, where every person thereafter learns more efficient learning that happened, if we're able to create a collective efficiency gain with each learning piece, there's no reason why we cannot recycle our collective time to discover collective agency. And I think that's a pattern that we could maybe those 6 million people are the first ones who pattern match that opportunity. I mean, I'd say that both what Grant and Saskia's past institutional context of when she was the virtual sustainable Stanford course that she was on, or the sustainability community that Cambridge created, that Grant was associated with. Each of these are learning containers that expected self-directed learning. But if we connect self-directed learning to diversified function, right now, law firms do pro bono and a few accounting firms. But if you had 10,000 marketing agencies, some of them can do pro bono. If you have 10,000 of every kind of business, some of them can do pro bono. What we need is the human capital stack of each of those. And I was speaking to someone this week from deep in the open source security community example, and he was saying that the pro bono stack of the open source community is deep, but it's not broad. It's not diversified. They haven't brought in millions of designers and user interface folks and people to make user-centered design feasible across technologies and approaches. And I think what he was saying is, if you could get diversified to every category of skill set, effectively that's what gives Game A its hyper-competitive advantage today, is that it's the only place where, through money, every skill set and every diversity of skill has been viable. But the truth is, for impact causes, we should be able to get enough diversified participation of enough micro-leadership from enough fields to have comprehensive agency vis-a-vis a social innovation one at a time.
And of course, we can do it in a hybrid fashion. Game B is really starting to move rapidly now. After having been a talk shop for, in my opinion, way too long, there is really movement towards creating what we call proto Bs, which are the first instantiations of people actually trying to live a Game B life. And by the way, compete with Game A while they're doing it. And one of the things that we make very clear to people thinking about a proto B is, don't think you can do it all. Right? You're not going to design your own computer chips for sure, right? And that's at the farthest end. But you're frankly not going to have your own high-tech medicine, or you're not going to build cars or anything else. But thinking of hybrids where there is a group of people operating as a cell with a membrane around it. And remember, a membrane is semi-permeable. Things go in, things go out. And you define your semi-permeable membrane around your Game B, Proto B, such that you do interact with Game A. In fact, you actually take things in from it, and then you go and compete with it, and you get positive return resources, particularly because you're organized about living less expensively in Game A terms. That's very important, both just from economies of scale of things like co-housing and shared automobiles and collective childcare, but also, most importantly, by reprogramming the ethos so that there is no status in collecting goods and positional goods. And so we live way less expensively in Game A terms, but we're actually more productive in Game A terms because we're, mentally more self-regulating. We're not, living in the middle of the rat race. We have achieved we have developed skills in self-organization so that our working groups are no longer psychologically destructive to us. They're empowering to us. And at least in some categories, we can combine those to literally outcompete Game A, including in some strange areas like ad agencies, right? Of all the vile Game A things, ad agencies are the worst, probably.
That brings up, not ad agencies just from the perspective of ads for anything, but if you think about affiliate marketing, using that for good, you could redirect consumption in the direction of impact products and services. I mean, I don't think an ad agency that's selling things that are horrible for the world could ever be game B or impact aligned or mission aligned. But if you're championing the products that make the world a profoundly better place, why not in that?
And you do it better. I mean, again, that's always been the argument of game B. That this is the theory you can't jump up a cliff, and so if game B is really going to be able to start from small cells and grow, those cells have to not be dependent on charity, right? It's not a long-term viable model for that to actually scale to hundreds of thousands.
Well, not in perpetuity, dependent purely on charity. I think the way to think about it is philanthropy is a catalytic capital in order to make the rest of the engines that create sustainability happen. But
yeah, we agree. And we do think that probably the first couple of proto Bs will have to have a fairly good injection of either philanthropic or non-economic capital injected into them of one form or another. However, I think if we focus on building community, like for instance, the Mennonites, one of the people we're looking at for models. Another one is the Israeli kibbutz movement. Those are both economically viable in the context of game A. And we do believe that designing to be freestanding and to be able to survive by parasitizing game A is actually quite important.
Well, I think that brings up where Grant's at now that his mic's working, which is that Sustainavista's grant, if we want to bring this thread together, is an example of, I think, a shared value approach of a group of international folks who've come together that are both trying to collaborate with the impact community and trying to effectively achieve economic sustainability through coalitions that wouldn't be traditionally possible. Did you want to react to what Jim was sharing, Grant?
Yeah, I mean, there are two or three things. So the one was, hi guys, one or two things that came up to mind. One was the hybrids and the prototyping, which I think is quite an interesting one, because that's really we want to get funding and involvement, because I think that's, you've got to get out of the like you said, the talk shop. We've actually got to start moving things forward in solutions and prototyping, and actually so really keen to develop those concepts a lot better. But the other one was something that you said, Bobby. I think you mustn't underestimate, but there's actually a hell of a lot more pro bono consultancy and professional services available than we think. A lot of companies, for example, I was at Salesforce last year, and I think they've got 6 to 8 days a year where they can actually work on projects. Every single member of staff of Salesforce, and they've actually, Salesforce actually offer them tools and their platform to develop prototypes and things like that. So there actually is, I think, an incredible resource. So going to what Jim, I mean, to take your prototyping and that kind of stuff, and I think it's EY or some of these other companies as well. A lot of them actually they can bring in their own projects. A lot of them just take the easy way out and just adopt, some of the big current charities and projects, and actually don't really look further than more strategic impact projects. And I want to just, I'll take a time out later, but actually something my wife was just talking about today, which was quite interesting. She was actually at her bank, ABN AMRO. They've had a vitality week this week, and they did, and they actually had another think tank came and spoke to them, but she hasn't seen the presentation yet, but she just heard about it today. But it's available to her company. Of a new where this think tank was actually saying, and they're working at the Dutch and European level, and they were saying that we've got to change the models from taxation, from taxing human capital, and rather going to taxing resources. And they were bringing other kinds of models in, so that we want people to start investing in people and investing in skills and changing the system. But we actually need to also change the system because if we keep on, because what's actually happened, because taxation of human capital is quite expensive in Europe, that's why a lot of companies have actually outsourced a lot of their services and to cheaper globalization, in that part of the globalization thing. So I was interested to find out what you guys thought about changing that model, where you actually start taxing resources higher. So you start, And we had a very interesting discussion of true pricing with coffee, which was actually quite interesting. That gets where the living wage becomes and regenerative agriculture becomes really important, because you've got to give these people at the source ways of actually, because the coffee industry, we had an incredible example of true pricing in coffee with Colombian Dutch, with 70 farmers from Colombia working in a cooperative, and they've actually got real data now that they've just done a reiteration of their model, and they've got 25 companies in Holland, and some of them are quite big companies, but they're not working. They say 35% of the world's coffee is the roaster is controlled by the big roasters, Starbucks, and there are a few other companies I can't remember. And we're just saying that the incentives, most of the coffee producers are actually running at a loss. Yeah. And there's just no way to change that, and that's with most agricultural products, sustainable agriculture for most, textiles, cotton, coffee, chocolate, everything, you cotton, everything you go through for all the things. So I was just thinking, one, how do we change the model? And I think is taxing resources high, is that something you think it could work? And how would that fit into your Plan B approach?
Well, actually, one of our thought leaders, a guy named Jordan Hall, is working on a plan using so-called Georgist taxation. Henry George was a late 19th century thinker, and he proposed the only tax should be a tax on land, and it should be very, very high. And the argument was that would force land into its highest use, et cetera. Now, we clearly don't want to do that because we're already past the carrying capacity of the earth. But Jordan's idea, not yet fully cooked, but he's got it partially worked out, is to do exactly that. That most tax would be based on, essentially would be on all forms of wealth as opposed to income. And he actually came up with a very, very clever self-enforcement method, because the first question is valuation. You have a business, what's it worth? Fuck if I know, but it's not publicly traded, right? Or you have a farm, what's it worth? Not hard to say. So he proposed using the claiming racehorse model, which I love. In claiming races, there's a class of horse racing. Let's say you're in a $5,000 claiming race. It basically means that anyone who's a part of the racing community can buy any of the horses that finish in the top four for the claiming price, right? So basically that means you set the value of your enterprise, and anyone can buy it from you for that price. Now, I've proposed that there be a 10% or 5% premium to avoid thrash, et cetera, and to have not have people not lose their life's work for no reason. But there's basically a self-enforcing mechanism, right? If you don't price it right, somebody will buy it from you, and he also proposed, and I love this, again, from a local agriculture perspective, that there would be a very major reduction in the tax rate, perhaps by 2/3, for people who are resident on the property. So the difference between rentier use of properties versus resident use of properties would be built right into the tax regime. And again, it has a whole series of ways that this money is then reapportioned out as UBIs, but UBIs at 4 different levels. One at the individual level, one at the family level, one at the neighborhood level, and one at the community level. And
there's a similarity in part to what you just described in zero subsidy affordable housing principle of what we've worked on, which is based all on the Stanford model, which 75 years ago, Stanford started buying half of each professor's home. And the subsidy for the professor is they only get a mortgage on the other half, and therefore they don't have to have as much debt, and their costs are dramatically lower accordingly. And they've done this without losing a penny compared to the rest of their market investments. In other words, Stanford has exceeded their market returns for the last 75 years from all their other investment categories with this. So it's zero subsidy affordable housing. And I think there needs to be more examples of approaches where, rather than treating the government as a source of subsidy, we treat the government or treat institutions as sources of scale, because there's other things that could become zero subsidy, not just affordable housing. There's the example you mentioned of regenerative food, there's potential to get investment to support this diversified production of products in almost every sector. Because right now there's no diversification for sweat equity investors. The venture capitalists get 100% diversification. Sweat equity investors get none. And so for all of these products, for 1,000, for 10,000, for 100,000 regenerative agriculture products for the same in each sector, we don't have the building of the products in a way that gives people a diversified risk. We basically place the risk on each entrepreneurial generation. But if we were to shift the risk premise to collective agency, to collectively taking bets, and to collectively having laboratories of collective experimentation, there's no reason why we could not accelerate learning to an exponential speed. We learned from earlier conversations with Bob Spohr talking about networked improvement communities, which compete with randomized control trials to show outperformance where there's optimal performance and not just average performance. And we've learned from NVU about context variation by design, where they look for outperformance too. What we need is processes that leverage the underutilized capacities of the world, which include, there's an unlimited amount almost of zero subsidy money. There's a very short supply of philanthropic money. And there's that underutilized capacity. And then there's underutilized capacities of other kinds that need to be stacked together. And in the civic engagement sense, that means stacking the pro bono commitments of diversified institutions like Grant and Karl were alluding to, and connecting those together to where there's an abundance, a new abundance, where we can unleash a new abundance. Because if we just show, for example, everyone that it's really zero subsidy to prevent half of homelessness, then maybe in 1,000 other places in the world that can happen too. Saskia, did you have feedback on the discussion so far? I want to be guided and influenced by you, and want to welcome your vantage point. You're on mute though. Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I love listening in too, so don't worry. But what you were just saying in regards to stacking the pro bono commitments, I think that is a super interesting project that we should start. I think just to get to build a database of all organizations, and maybe it already exists, I don't know, but I don't think it does. Otherwise, we would know better that where the pro bono resources sit. But to indeed just get somebody to collect all pro bono hours that are available, starting with the Fortune companies, but going around to different countries and different companies as well, and build that database of people, skill sets, capacities, and then link them to the social innovation projects that we know need to be done, and create projects with those people. Indeed, as Grant said, people are looking for easy ways they want to use those days, and they want easy ways to contribute and create impact. And if we could provide that and link them together with other pro bono people around the world, you get that acceleration of learning, you get the acceleration of innovation.
Yeah, maybe we should. One example is, I think that we could state already the first 100,000 years of labor's worth of work is imaginable, right? In other words, we know where there are under-leveraged processes at scale. Each person has 100,000 hours in a life's work. If you talk about 100,000 years of work, people realize that we need collaboration at greater scales across generations. I don't think we all need to be at the time scale of, Long Now Foundation, looks at it at a very long time scale, hundreds of years. I think we're talking about shorter time scales than that for some of these exponentially important problems. And that's why our collaboration needs to get to a greater depth and scale more quickly. So I think that's sort of our theory of change, Jim. If you think about this in the context of a big change coalition that you've identified with, is that we think that the interdisciplinary diversity is being wrongly estimated by our sector on a regular basis. We think that it's like sort of like World War I, and you have waves of infantry going into hopeless odds. That's what our social innovation sector looks like right now. They're each going up against an interdisciplinary complexity and interdisciplinary intersectionality, which is the equivalent of an army against each one of them. And we're losing them left, right, and center, losing some of the most wonderful minds, thoughtful humans, caring individuals, because they're each taking on a battle that they never should have had to take on. We've been, as theorists, sending them in saying they could be a master of the fields they need to be successful, when there's more fields needed to be intersectionally considered in order to actually get them optimized. If NVU can get 80% or more of their social ventures to not die, to succeed over time, then why are we inviting a generation to have a business model aspiration in mind in which we can expect them to have a 95% failure rate plus? We're losing good humans and good social enterprises for preventable reasons.
Yeah, I very much like, and I wish I have not yet had a chance to talk with you in greater depth, this idea of diversification, because as we know in finance, the only free lunch in finance is diversification. The greatest theoretical advance in finance came in the late 70s through something called modern portfolio theory, and you can actually prove that diversification is a free lunch. The rough sketch you've drawn for me in previous conversations of establishing a pooling method whereby people get little pieces of many large number of social entrepreneurhood ventures goes a long way to making it a more viable life's work. I mean, in venture startup, you can afford to take the risk, at least some people can, because the payoffs are gigantic, right? But in social entrepreneurhood, the payoff is basically you get to keep your job, right? And there's no asymmetric payoff. You're making an asymmetric bet without the asymmetric payoff. And that makes no economic sense, actually, to a person who's only motivated by economics, which, of course, we know nobody is homo economicus. We know that is a false straw man argument. But nonetheless, economic reality is a force on everybody, particularly those of us like myself. I came from a very humble background. My father dropped out of high school in 9th grade. My mother left home when she was 14. My dad was a big city cop. I really didn't even know anybody that was college educated other than school teachers and doctors, right? So, I could not have pursued a career trajectory that did not make at least nominal economic sense. It would have made no sense for me to have been a social entrepreneur when I was 25 years old, even though I probably would have been a good thing for me to do. But if you had a Bobbian, is that a word? If it isn't, it should be, or Fishkinian form of diversified interest in a large portfolio of social entrepreneurhood, which basically means only on average does it have to work, right? And you get to keep your job, and you get to do work to make the world better instead of being a game A motherfucker, as I like to call them. Then it could have made sense for someone like me. Definitely could not have in the way it's set up now.
Well,
so anyway, I'd like to learn a lot more about that.
I 100% agree with the sweat equity diversification thesis part that you referenced, and would love to share more on that thread specifically. But I want to mention that the kind of diversification that I was sharing about just prior to that was actually the other part of diversification. In other words, we have economic diversification, such as getting the sweat equity diversity, like where you get a share of the pool rather than just the one social enterprise. That's what we were just thinking about. But there's this other piece, which is that the social enterprise themselves are not having the interdisciplinary diversification that they need to be successful. We're telling 3 social entrepreneurs, graduate from a university, start a social enterprise, or started in mid-career, and started as a retiree, started at any level, at any point in life. If the model is you can achieve systemic change in a world in which there's more than 10,000 disciplines that are crisscrossing the world, and where you think you're going to be master of 99% of the fields that affect your success, we're asking for a form of magical thinking on the part of the social entrepreneurs if they're going to have had 100 lifetimes to have all the fields of expertise to be able to de-risk a real social innovation that solves a major global problem. I mean, that is in itself a problem, is that we have the expectation that 3 people can address social enterprise challenges the way in startups sometimes you've got a small number of people that create something that scales extraordinarily. I think in systems change, there's more collaboration called for potentially, because there's more impact integral consequences of not integrating other fields into that context, I think. So, but I totally agree. We need the diversification of fields and the economic diversification and the interdisciplinary diversification proportionate to our purposes.
Yeah, that's why I liked last time when we spoke, how we talked about, what I said was my main insight from last time, that we are all part of that system, and bringing the clusters together around a specific social innovation gap. I think each individual social entrepreneur can focus on their individual piece, but as you said, they do need on their own, they're not going to fix that gap, but together they can fix that gap. And if they know each other and work together in the most efficient way to fix that gap, then you cross all the disciplines and you cross all the you scale it up in such a way that you actually together as part of that system will fix that gap. And I think that is, in retrospective, if I think about the doppelgangers group that we set up on around volunteering systems, or if you take it that broad, is pretty much with that in mind too. Like, all of us, as we have found out, all of us are focusing on the same sort of thing, but all do it in a slightly different way, and therefore addressing a slightly different piece of the puzzle together. And we don't have all of them yet. We don't have the whole gap crossed yet. But if you do this together and work collaboratively instead of competitively, you will be able to fix that. And I think that is a potential solution to what you're just posing as being the issue of an individual social entrepreneur.
Well, maybe we could talk about this as stages of ecosystem development. You have one level, which is the systems integration level that the large enterprise world got to, in terms of saying that they have some context where all these components fit together. You have other stages of where you have APIs and ecosystems partnering that way. You have other stages of sector building where you're just getting these people to trust each other, getting people to know each other, or getting people to reuse standards within a field. And then you have joint venturing at the level of they're hybridizing this part of it and they're taking it on together. And so I think that we could say, what is the collaboration gap for sustainability, for climate change, for each of these areas? Grant, do y'all see yourselves in Sustainavistas as sort of tackling a part of the sustainability and climate change collaboration gap? Is that sort of a premise of Sustainavistas? You're on mute though, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love the idea of setting up multidisciplinary teams. So we're literally trying to focus areas now. Are looking for projects or calls to fund or pitching. I mean, we're disappointed we didn't get the European Investment Bank, but why don't we focus on other areas? I mean, we definitely have the people. We just don't have the projects and the funding for it at the moment. That's our struggle. So it's and I think that they sort of chicken and the egg. But at the same time, I mean, we literally we've got we've got we're starting to set up webinars now, not just people talking to us, but how can we start developing projects out of them, basically. So, and I love the idea of getting the multidisciplinary, because I mean, we've got, like I said, over 300 people, and probably some of them, I mean, we've still got the 2080 rules, so not all of them are going to be as active. But the other side is we've also got some big companies in there as well. So we could also, so that's another area we're trying to develop, is how can we get some of these big companies to actually invest in these prototyping projects for us?
Well, I think there's the investing, which is getting their CSR, philanthropy, or et cetera. And then there's also the sustainable development goal integration, which is saying every large company has a gap between what their products and services could be most uniquely able to supercharge and impact cause with, what is their unique opportunity to have leverage, and are there entrepreneurs at those organizations willing to discover that mission. And I would love to have a systems change embassy at every major institution in the world to translate from the systems change community what we need of them. And then, maybe they listen, maybe they don't. But at least, if you have an ambassador cycle of a micro leadership role, like a role for each institution to say, okay, here is where we see this institution creating consequences that are harmful, and here's where we would love them to reduce the harm, and here's where we think they could have transformational consequence. From a big change point of view, Jim, what do you think of this context of a systems change ambassador to each institutional context? Or how do you see the coalition reaching critical thresholds of scale in that kind of context?
Truthfully, I haven't gotten that far. I think that's an interesting idea. I really like the idea of ambassadors that can take ideas out and, essentially and quite literally do what ambassadors used to do, which was to, spread the word. Interesting concept. I'll have to think on that one.
Karl, what do you think of this thread of if there are institutions that are falling short of a fair share model's level of fairness and justice to stakeholders, that there's in the UK they have a shadow government, and you have a shadow position for each role by the opposition, in other words, you could have that from a systems change point of view. You could have in a sense, systems change is not very user-centered design predicated right now. In other words, if you're an institution and you learn that there's this concept of systems change, it hasn't necessarily been translated how that Fortune 500 company or how that philanthropic institution or how that NGO exists in a potential extraordinary alignment with others for systems change. In other words, they don't know who's on which side of them and which adjacency that they need to be in collaboration in which way. But in other words, if each institution had a map of here's the systems change gap, here's your role in addressing the systems change, here's a narrative, alternative history of the future in which you take on a differential role in the system, and that would achieve all these justice goals and fairness goals and et cetera. It's not one shift, but it's effectively a portfolio of hypothetical shifts that could be visually communicated to them as a narrative frame of reference. In other words, we invite each institution to take on their role in systemic change, and we are willing to do a little bit of the preparatory work to try to figure out what that could mean. And they are invited, like Glassdoor invites employees of every large company to participate. What if we invited employees of every large company to participate in imagining how those companies could play roles in systemic change too, right? I mean, in other words, why are the people who are the entrepreneurs all isolated? Why are why are the people who are not trying to help the world collaborating more effectively than the people who are trying to help the world? The entrepreneurs are isolated as all anything in these institutions. How do we give them a channel for aligning with all the theoretically feasible places for us to exponentially achieve the impact goals?
All right, I see what you were saying now. Yes, I kind of had it backwards, which I sometimes do. If we took the idea of activating intrapreneurs to become part of the big change coalition, you'd achieve what you're talking about. And that
Exactly.
and that part of the Big Change Coalition would be to provide support, holistic support, to your earlier point about the need for cross-disciplinary teams that are broader than a typical weekly funded internal entrepreneur has, to create an envisioning of how some of these not necessarily engaged today institutions might be part of serious systems change, because we have the entrepreneur who has at least some knowledge and standing within the organization, it can be realistic. We often hear this stuff, from political people. This is how we can make corporations better, blah, blah, blah. But they don't know a damn thing about how the corporation actually works and what its issues are. Those things aren't very likely to be very accurate. But if you have someone from the inside guiding the process, well, what is reasonable, but yet nonetheless is systemic change? That could be very powerful. That's a very good idea. And I'm happy to add it into the stew of the concept of the Big Change Coalition. I think it actually adds a lot to the concept.
Well, and it may be something that CrowdDoing and the Big Change Coalition could be in collaborative cahoots on an intentionality of. I think it's something that I find really interesting. But let me see our other key leader of CrowdDoing context, Saskia. What do you think of this idea of systemic change ambassadors on the one side to effectively peer mentor systems change oriented entrepreneurs on the other, and together become an ecosystem of support for social innovations on the outside?
Yeah, obviously that is a good idea. And I've always seen myself as an entrepreneur to start with, when, being the Stanford course was focused on entrepreneurs too. So that whole community are entrepreneurs support, and you can see that they're looking for that support outside. And if you can focus that support on systems thinking, I think that will definitely have legs. And there are there are some coalitions currently trying to do that, I'd say. Like even if I look at the Future Fit model that I've referred to before.
Jim, have you heard of these guys, the Future Fit model?
No.
Could you give a bit of context for us?
It's called the Future Fit Business Benchmark, and it is a UK-based not-for-profit that have set this up, and it is a systems approach to business performance with a scientific background. So what they've done is it's like in the back, it's based on the natural step, which you may have heard of. But it is a model that helps corporations. For now, they're also building a government and an industry model at the moment. But and it helps corporations to aim for a point in time where they know to operate without causing any further harm, and then after that also have regeneration. But the point in time of where you can operate without causing any further harm is from a holistic perspective identified and broken down in 23 goals that are scientifically backed and have measurable context. And what they're trying to do, the background that they had, is actually to create a model that is global and can be comparable, and give every business a very logical path to where you should be as an organization. So where you actually have crossed all those social innovation gaps, really, as individual businesses and collectively, because you're all aiming for that same point in time, which is reaching what they call a break-even point for each business. And the way that they operate is really also because they do it from a not-for-profit perspective. The two founders are definitely system thinkers, and it forces you to system think as well as an organization if you commit to that, because it is like the SDG model, which is really hard to interpret as a business, but the concept is the same, that you have to achieve all those goals. You can't go, I'm just going to focus on poverty to achieve systems change in the world. And that's what the focus is. As a business, you need to take that on as well. And the support coming out of the Future Fit Foundation is that they're actually also setting up these groups of entrepreneurs that are driving the future fit thinking within the different companies to work together. Because if you do this together, these goals, whether that be globally or nationally or locally, those goals become easier to achieve.
But in those cases, they're doing all that, but those are not then connecting to the outside social innovations. They're only within the entrepreneurs amongst each other, not those entrepreneurs aligning to the external world of systems change.
Yeah, with some of the goals, that's definitely something they are trying to do, because like I said, like there is for instance, one of the goals is around product circularity, for instance. And if the connection was built into that social entrepreneur system where there are products available that are more circular and all that sort of thing, then the goals for the company, for the corporates, become easier to achieve if they know where to go to actually create, have those, but they haven't built that yet. I mean, it's not that far developed as yet.
So I think the question is, do we see a gap there? I still see a gap from what I've seen from Future Fit as far as what we're talking about with systems change, coalition building, because I don't think they're talking about all of the same pieces of systems change that we are. They're talking about a subset of them, and I think there's more of them that are needed. So, but feedback on this idea, Karl, from your side? You're on mute, Karl. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, you're on mute. Okay. I mean,
No, I got it. That one icon doesn't unmute, even though it looks like it should. So there's a lot of ideas here. I guess succinctly, my thoughts are is that system thinking is an important thing for people who are actually making any kind of change. They have to be system thinkers. But I think system change is not something that's going to attract a lot of people. It's sort of like a passageway you have to go through. You go from system thinking to system change, but you got to wind up. The real attraction is going to be the outcomes you can have. The idea of system change is.
You're saying that the attractor is systems changed, past tense.
Well, I think system change is sort of vague, and it can be off-putting to people, because why change something that's not broken? Or why? How do you know you're not going to make it worse by changing it? So I think system change is a concept of like a catalyst that can be helpful. You want to be having system thinkers, but you really want to get over to outcomes where you can be changing something. To get from system thinking to the outcomes, you need to be thinking about system change, but you don't want to emphasize the change as much as the outcome. And the thing that seems to be a common denominator in a lot of efforts to do something is access to capital. And so maybe part of the system thinking is to popularize different ideas as to how to attract capital. The one that you used, Bobby, for the housing at Stanford, that was a pretty compelling one. And what it does is it becomes that catalyst to say, oh, we can rethink this classical problem of housing, perhaps, with a different approach. But you really want to focus on what you're trying to to create it at the end, and maybe that's the way to attract capital, to focus on those outcomes. But I think sometimes there's a little bit too much emphasis on just system change per se, because it has a potential downside, and it's not necessarily what's going to attract more than the 2% of people that Jim was referring to early on.
So you're saying that maybe it's not systems change ambassadors. Maybe there's another narrative way to refer to that role. Maybe that's a good functional descriptor, but maybe we need to find a narrative. Maybe that's, we've built a user-centered designed team within one of our teams. Maybe we need to build another collaborative alliance of that. I think this is really interesting, and I would welcome continuing these threads. I welcome the collaboration between Fair Share Model and CrowdDoing. Thank you, Karl. I welcome the collaboration with Sustainavistas. Thank you, Grant. I welcome the collaboration, Jim, with the Big Change Coalition and the ecosystem that you are constellating in Game B. And Saskia, it's a privilege to collaborate on CrowdDoing.world. Thanks, y'all, for collaborating here today on #SystemsChange. Have a great Friday, y'all.
And thank you, Bobby. Good job again, as usual, right?
Bye.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, I get out of here. Here we go.